The back garden was quiet at this hour, just before the sun fully cleared the hill. A thin mist clung to the edges of the fence like it wasn't ready to let the morning in. Eleanor bent toward the thyme patch, her knees crackling softly as she crouched. The earth smelled damp and sweet. She ran her fingers through the leaves, not to harvest, just to feel something alive. The herbs had become her companions. Lavender, sage, mint, lemon balm. They grew steadily, silently, without needing much. Unlike people, the neighbors called her Miss L, or the Tea Lady. A few brought their children to see the garden, wide-eyed and giggling. None of them asked questions. That was how she liked it. She didn't speak of Maple Street, of the blue house with the white shutters and the dark secrets tucked between its floorboards. She didn't talk about the basement, or the birthdays, or the silence. Especially not the silence. "I make a good cup of lavender tea," she would say, if someone lingered too long at the gate. And that was all. No mention of the 20 years between her childhood and the day she vanished. No mention of who she used to be before she ran, or why she had to. But now, she thought maybe it was time. She rose from the ground slowly, brushing dirt from her palms onto her floral print dress. Her hands were weathered and broad, the kind that remembered the weight of too many secrets. She crossed to the porch, filled the kettle, and set it on the hot plate. Her tiny kitchen, tucked into the corner of a rented unit in a quiet northern town, smelled like lemon oil and old wood. She pulled her journal from the drawer under the counter. Its leather cover was scuffed, the pages thick and unlined. She hadn't written in it for years. Not since the trial, not since the verdict. But today, something nudged her. Maybe it was the ache in her knees, or the dream she'd had the night before, where she stood outside the blue house again and realized the front door was gone. Maybe it was just time. She took her tea out to the garden, settling into the wooden chair beside the rosemary bush. The breeze lifted her braid from her shoulder and cooled the sweat on the back of her neck. She sipped once, then opened the journal and began to write. "My name is Eleanor May Anders. I was born in 1952 in a town that doesn't remember me, and I grew up in a house that pretended to love me. I lived there until I was 28. 20 years I spent inside those walls, pretending to be normal, pretending I wasn't dying inside." Paused. The words came too easily. She hadn't expected that. Eleanor looked out toward the pine trees bordering the back fence. Their tops swayed in slow rhythm, just enough to remind her she was far from that place now. She'd found this town on accident, or maybe providence. A bus had broken down on the way north. She stepped off to stretch her legs and didn't get back on. No one noticed. No one called the police. No one posted flyers. She stayed at a hostel that first night, then found work cleaning motel rooms. Cash, quiet, no questions. She lied about her age, said she was 40. People believed her. Trauma makes you older. The tea cooled in her cup. She scribbled again. The thing people don't understand about abuse is how ordinary it becomes. You stop asking why. You stop dreaming about rescue. You stop believing in anyone. Eventually, you even stop believing in yourself. He wasn't always a monster. Not outside. My father was charming when he wanted to be. He had one of those deep, steady voices people trust. He'd say, "Good morning," to our neighbor, Mrs. Keating, and she'd smile like he'd handed her sunshine. But I knew that voice could turn to thunder in a second. He never yelled in public. At home, he didn't need to. His hands did the yelling. Eleanor stopped again. The cup trembled slightly in her grip. She set it down carefully, inhaled the lavender scent. She hadn't said her father's name out loud in more than 3 decades. Even writing it now felt like summoning a shadow. She wrote it anyway. Richard. And as the pen scratched the page, my mother's name was Darlene. She never hit me. She never helped me either. When I was 8 and the bruises started showing, she bought me long-sleeved shirts for the summer. When I was 10 and tried to tell her, she said, "We don't speak badly of your father." And when I was 12 and started locking my bedroom door at night, she had it removed. Her silence was louder than his fists. A bird landed on the garden fence, chirping twice before fluttering off again. Eleanor watched it disappear into the trees. She wondered how far it would fly, if it had ever been caught in a net, if it remembered. She took another sip of tea. The lavender had cooled, but the flavor was strong. Steady. She looked down at the page. People say time heals everything. That's a lie. Time buries things, but they don't go away. They just grow roots. The scars are still here. Not all of them are visible. Some of them live in my bones, in the way I flinch when someone raises their voice, in how I sit with my back to a wall in every room, in the way I fold my hands in my lap when I speak, like I'm still trying not to upset anyone. But something else grew too. Something good. It didn't grow from them. It grew in spite of them. It grew when I got off that bus and didn't get back on. Eleanor closed the journal. She had said enough for one day. She reached for her shears and clipped a few sprigs of mint. Tomorrow she would plant something new. Maybe lemon verbena. Maybe chamomile. Something soft. Something that healed. She stood, cradling the herbs in her palm. The wind brushed her braid across her shoulder, and she tucked it back. Her fingers steady. Tomorrow, maybe she would tell someone. Maybe someone needed to hear. But for now, she turned back toward the kitchen, her silhouette long in the morning light, the scent of lavender trailing behind her like a memory she no longer feared. The library down the road had never asked for much more than her name. When Eleanor had first walked through its glass doors nearly 10 years ago, the clerk, a soft-spoken man named Lionel, had handed her a library card and said, "Everyone deserves access to stories." She'd nodded, grateful. There had been no forms to verify who she was. No background checks. Just ink on paper and a warm smile. This morning, Eleanor returned there with the leather journal tucked under her arm. It was too soon to write more, but not too soon to remember. She needed to remember carefully, the way one lifts an old photograph from a brittle album slowly, with both hands. Inside, the library smelled of old pages and lemon polish. A group of teenagers murmured near the fiction shelves. A mother read, aloud to her toddler near the beanbags. Eleanor moved toward the local history room, where she could sit with her thoughts in peace. The windows there faced the back alley, where the dumpsters were. But no one used this room much. That's why. She liked it. Quiet things could breathe here. She chose the seat beneath the clock and opened the journal again. I remember the day my father took my photograph and pinned it to the corkboard above his desk. I was 11. The picture was from school, me in my best sweater, the one with the tiny embroidered roses. My hair had been brushed out, my smile small and unsure. He told me he liked it because it made me look obedient. He said it reminded him how good I could be when I tried. That photo stayed there until the day I left. I wonder if he kept it after. She paused. Her hands rested flat on the page. The memory of that photograph tightened something behind her ribs. Not because of the image itself, but because of what it had meant. A trophy. A warning. Proof. Outside, the wind rattled. The leaves against the window. Eleanor lifted her head. She remembered the way her father would tap his knuckle beneath the photo when she misbehaved. He never shouted. He just looked at her, then the photo, and said, "You used to be better than this." And she'd believe him. That's how control works. It rewrites your past. A sudden wave of fatigue rolled over her. She closed the journal. Her mind wasn't ready to stay in that room today. Instead, she stood and wandered to the biographies, running her fingers along the spines. So many lives, written and remembered. Eleanor sometimes thought she'd like to be in a book not for fame, but for proof. To remind herself she had existed, and that what happened wasn't imagined. She pulled down a slim volume about a woman who had escaped a cult. The woman's eyes on the cover were wide, focused, alive. Eleanor opened to a random page and read. "I didn't run because I was brave. I ran because I wanted to see what breathing without fear felt like." She traced the sentence with her fingertip. That was the thing people misunderstood. Escape didn't feel like flight. It felt like drowning, then finally gasping for air. After years underwater, she checked out the book, slid it into her woven bag, and left the library. The walk home took 15 minutes along a road lined with sycamores. Their roots had cracked the sidewalk in places. Eleanor moved slowly, careful of her step. As she walked, she passed the window of the town's only bakery, where the clerk inside gave her a small wave. She returned it. In her early days here, Eleanor had offered to trade dried herbs for bread. The baker had accepted without hesitation. That barter had been the beginning of her sense that maybe, in small ways, she could belong. Back at her cottage, the kitchen clock struck noon. She fixed herself a sandwich and sat at the table. Across from her, on the windowsill, stood a framed photograph, a recent one. It showed her with Lionel and the baker's wife, all holding mugs of tea at the last library fundraiser. She looked happy in the picture, but below it, behind the curtain, tucked deep in the drawer, was a different photo. The school portrait. The one she'd found in a box last year, while organizing the old belongings she'd smuggled away in a single suitcase. She had stared at it for hours the day she rediscovered it. The sweater, the shy smile, the eyes too old for 11. She never threw it away, because it proved she'd been real, and that the child who survived all those years deserved to be remembered, not erased. Eleanor stood and took the photo out now. She held it in both hands, studied it. Her hands no longer matched. The ones in the picture hers now bore liver spots, wrinkles, strength earned. But the child's hands had once gripped the edge of her school desk like it was the only solid thing in her world. She took a breath. Then, for the first time in decades, she slid the photo into a new frame and placed it next to the newer one on the WINDOWSILL. Woman who lived. One for the girl who endured. Outside, the wind was picking up. A storm, maybe, or just the seasons changing. Eleanor pulled a cardigan over her floral print dress and stepped back into the garden. She needed rosemary for dinner. But more than that, she needed to stand in the place that had taught her how to nurture, how to root, how to begin again. As she crouched by the rosemary, a child's laugh drifted in from somewhere down the street. She didn't flinch this time. Instead, she smiled. Eleanor didn't often go into town on Fridays. The bakery was busier than usual, the streets louder, and she preferred the quiet rhythm of her garden. But this morning, she woke with a heaviness in her chest that made the walls of her cottage feel closer than comfort allowed. She needed to be around strangers. People who didn't know what she'd lived through, but smiled anyway. People who passed her without stopping, carrying groceries or holding hands, making noise without asking for her to speak. She folded her journal closed, slipped it into her woven bag, and buttoned her cardigan over her floral print dress. Before stepping outside, she glanced once more at the two framed photographs on the sill, the child and the woman. For the first time, she left them there uncovered. UNHIDDEN. It wasn't courage exactly, but it was something close. The walk, too. Town took longer today. Her knees had stiffened in the night, and the humidity clung to her skin. As she passed the old water tower, a group of boys pedaled past her on bicycles, one of them shouting over his shoulder, "Morning, Miss Al." She lifted a hand in return. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice held steady. "Morning, Nathan." It startled her, hearing her voice aloud in daylight. The town square was full of life. A farmer's truck had parked under the oak trees, crates of tomatoes and sweet corn spilling over the tailgate. An elderly couple sat on the shaded bench near the war memorial, their hands clasped tightly between them. Eleanor made her way to her favorite bench across from the fountain, the one tucked behind a hedge of rosebush where she could watch the world without feeling watched. She sat slowly, folded her hands in her lap, and let her eyes wander. Children tossed pennies into the fountain, laughing as they made wishes. A woman with a stroller tried to quiet a crying baby. A man in a suit leaned against a tree, scrolling through his phone, unaware that the breeze was pulling his tie into the sunlight. It was all so ordinary, so beautifully, painfully ordinary. Eleanor's fingers found the edge of her journal. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, her thoughts drifted to the visitors' bench outside the prison, where her parents had been held after the trial. It had been nearly 30 years, but she remembered the color of the concrete, the iron bars over the glass, the stale air of that visitation room. She had only gone once, not to see him, to see her. Darlene. Her mother had looked smaller than Eleanor. Remembered, still neat, still composed, but reduced somehow, like someone who had forgotten the sound of her own footsteps. Eleanor had walked in, clutching a paper cup of water they'd handed her at the entrance, and sat across from the woman, who had once buttoned her school blouses with trembling hands. "You don't have to say anything," Eleanor had said quietly. "I just wanted you to see that I survived." Her mother hadn't cried, hadn't spoken at all for several minutes. When she finally did, her voice sounded more brittle than Eleanor had expected. "You were always strong," she said. It wasn't an apology, not even close. But Eleanor hadn't needed one then. She had already stopped expecting it. The sound of a violin pulled her back into the present. A busker had set up at the far end of the square, his case open at his feet, playing something soft and slow, a tune she didn't recognize, but one that made her eyes sting. Music always did that. It slipped through the cracks of memory like water through stone. She pulled the journal into her lap and opened it to a fresh page. "There are days when the silence still finds me. It waits in the corners of the morning, just before the kettle whistles. It crouches in the long shadows of the trees when I walk home at dusk. But there's something else now too. A voice. Small, but steady. It tells me that what happened wasn't my fault. That I wasn't bad. That I wasn't broken. That I wasn't to blame. That voice sounds like me. Not the girl in the photo. Not the woman who ran. But the one who stayed." She paused, let the pen rest, and looked around again. The violinist was finishing his set. A few coins clinked into his case. An older woman in a peach shawl walked by and nodded at her. Eleanor nodded back. There was no recognition in her face, no knowledge of Eleanor's history, no weight in her gaze. Just kindness. And that, too, was enough. She stood slowly, closing the journal, and turned back toward the sidewalk. On her way past the vendor truck, she bought a small bundle of wildflowers, chamomile, Queen Anne's lace, and a single bluebell wrapped in brown paper. She didn't ask why. She just needed to carry something beautiful back home. She placed the bouquet in the ceramic pitcher by the window. Between the two photographs, the girl and the woman, and now the wildflowers, a trinity of memory. Of what was, what is, and what could still be. Eleanor had always been careful about what she kept. A small wooden box sat in the back of her closet, buried beneath old linens and a folded quilt. She hadn't opened it in years, though she knew exactly what was inside. Letters. Some written by her, some written to her. None ever mailed. None ever answered. That morning, after tending to the rosemary and placing water beside the pitcher of wildflowers, she pulled the box out with slow deliberation. Dust clung to the lid like memory. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. The box creaked as it opened. Inside were envelopes of various sizes, some still sealed, others torn open along the edge. They smelled faintly of ink, old glue, and time. She reached for one near the top, her handwriting, unsteady but familiar, addressed simply to Dr. Sarah Chun. Dear Dr. Chun, you don't know me by this name. Back then, I was just Eleanor A. In your intake notes, a girl with downcast eyes and silent lips. You probably don't remember every face, but I remember yours. I remember the way you asked questions no one else had ever asked me. The way you waited for answers without pushing. The way your silence made space for mine. You told me, it's not your fault. That was the first time I considered it might be true. Eleanor folded the letter closed before finishing. That one had been written the first year she arrived in this town. She had meant to send it, but something stopped her. Fear, maybe. Or the belief that her words wouldn't matter. That even gratitude wouldn't reach someone like Dr. Chen, someone who had already given so much and disappeared into the next story, the next survivor. The other letters were harder. One was addressed to her mother. The envelope was sealed but never stamped. She remembered writing it late at night, shaking with something between rage and grief. Another letter bore no address at all. Just a name, written in large, careful print. Clara. Her mother's first name. She had never called her that aloud. It felt too distant, too final. But on paper, it gave her room to speak truthfully. She hesitated, then opened that one. The fold. Marks were crisp from years of being untouched. Clara. I'm not writing to ask why. I know why. You were afraid, or angry, or too far inside your own pain to see mine. Maybe all of those things. Maybe none of them. But I'm writing because I need you to know that I remember everything. The way you watched and did nothing. The way you set out the towels. The way you turned up the radio. You didn't hold the weapon, but you laid the path. You told yourself you were keeping peace in the house, that you were protecting what was left of your life, but you sacrificed mine to do it. I was a child. Eleanor stopped. Her throat tightened. She folded the letter gently and slid it back into its envelope. Some truths didn't need to be read again. Some had already been carved into the years. She took out one final note from the bottom of the box. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It wasn't signed. It was simply a sheet of lined paper with a single sentence in the center. I still don't know what love is supposed to feel like. She read it 3 times. Then she set it aside and pushed the box away. The room felt heavy now. Not with sorrow, but with something denser. A kind of acknowledgement. Eleanor stood and walked to the sink, ran cool water over her hands and watched as droplets traced the lines of her skin. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but release. Later, she put on her walking shoes and headed down the back path through the trees. It was a trail only locals used, winding past the creek and toward the old train tracks that hadn't carried a train in 20 years. It had been this path she followed the day she arrived here, after stepping off that bus and walking until her legs shook. That day she carried no luggage, only a shoulder bag and a pair of shoes that blistered her heels raw. But she had kept walking. She reached the bench near the creek, a weathered plank of wood nestled between two cypress trees, and sat down. This time, she didn't need the journal. She just needed the sound of water and wind. A breeze stirred her braid, laying it gently across her shoulder. She closed her eyes. There had been a girl once, maybe 9 or 10, who lived next door to the blue house. Eleanor couldn't remember her name now. Lana, maybe, or Lainey. She had invited Eleanor over to play tea party once, and Eleanor had gone, just for an hour. She remembered porcelain cups, mismatched saucers, and little butter cookies with sugar crystals on top. It had been the only time she could remember being inside another home that wasn't school or church. The only time she had been offered a second cookie without being asked what she had done to deserve it. When the girl's mother saw Eleanor's bruised arms, she said nothing, just gently adjusted the sleeves of Eleanor's cardigan, then offered her a smile and said, "Stay as long as you want." That memory had floated to the back of her mind for decades, mostly forgotten. But now, in the quiet by the creek, it returned whole. Eleanor opened her eyes. It had been kindness. Small, imperfect, but kindness nonetheless. And maybe, she thought, that was the beginning of what love could feel like. Not grand declarations, not roses, just someone seeing your bruises and still pouring the tea. She stood slowly and made her way back home, her hands at her sides, her spine tall, no longer afraid of returning to a space filled with silence. That evening she lit a single candle and set the box of letters on the kitchen table. One by one, she read each note aloud, softly, as if releasing their words into the air for the last time. When she finished, she tied the envelopes with twine and placed them back in the box, not to hide them, but to honor them. They were part of her, but they no longer ruled her. She poured herself a cup of tea lavender, this time with honey, and sat by the window as dusk fell. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, and the wildflowers leaned gently in the fading light. Saturday morning arrived with the scent of damp earth and the sound of birdsong slipping through Eleanor's window. She hadn't slept well. Too many memories stirred loose by the letters, too much weight shifting in the quiet corners of her chest. But she rose early, moving through her small kitchen with practiced calm. The tea was steeping when she remembered the book she had borrowed from the library days ago, still tucked under a linen napkin on her knitstand. She retrieved it and flicked to the page she had marked with a sprig of dried mint. The line she had underlined still hit her the same way. You don't need to be found by the world. You only need to find yourself. It wasn't that Eleanor had expected the world to come searching for her when she disappeared, but part of her, a younger and more fragile part, had hoped that anyone might have noticed her absence, that her leaving would have left a shape in someone's life. No calls had come. No footsteps had ever followed her through that bus station. The only thing that had ever chased her was silence. That she was learning now that absence doesn't mean worthlessness. And being forgotten doesn't make you forgettable. After breakfast, she slipped the book into her bag and walked into town. The library was quieter than usual, just Lionel at the desk and a student near the window, flipping through a textbook with slow disinterest. The autumn sun lit the high shelves in angled streaks of gold. Eleanor approached the counter and smiled gently. "Good morning, Miss L," Lionel said, adjusting his glasses. "Back already? I needed to return this one," she said, handing him the book. "And I was wondering, do you still keep the local history donation logs?" His brow lifted slightly. "We do. Not many ask for them. I'd like to. See who's listed from the 1960s to mid-70s. He hesitated. You looking for someone in particular? Eleanor folded her hands in front of her. Just a name. Mine. Lionel nodded, catching something in her tone that made him set the book aside and say nothing more. He led her into the records room and pulled out an aged leather binder with curled corners. She sat at the large table while he left her alone. Pages were handwritten in the early years, later typed. School rosters, church bake sales, scout fundraisers. Columns of names. Anders, Bellamy, Chen, Doyle. Each one a small fingerprint of a life once lived out loud. She scanned carefully. Then again nothing no Eleanor Anders. Not on any list. Not under the Girl Scout attendance sheet. Not under school playcast rosters. Not under community garden contributors. Not under anything. Her mother had made sure of that. Every time Eleanor had asked to sign up for something, her father said no. When she begged to join after-school clubs, her mother gave a soft smile and said, "We have our own traditions at home." Even when the school counselor once called to say Eleanor was talented in creative writing, the letter was returned unopened. She hadn't been forgotten. She had been erased. Eleanor's hands rested on the page. Not clenched, not trembling, just still. She sat like that for several minutes before she whispered aloud to the empty room. But I was there. And she was. She remembered sitting in the third row of Mrs. Keller's fifth-grade class, watching. The other girls rehearse lines for the school play she wasn't allowed to join. She remembered standing behind the lemonade booth one summer, while other children counted coins, and her mother made her hand over the jar without speaking. She remembered writing poems on scraps of paper and hiding them in her dresser because her father once said that girls who wrote too much thought too much. She was there, and no binder in the world could undo that. When she returned to the front desk, Lionel was shelving new returns. "Did you find what you were looking for?" he asked. Eleanor smiled softly. "Not on the page. But I remembered what I needed." He gave her a curious look but didn't press. She liked that about him. Before she left, he handed her a folded slip of paper. "We've been inviting community members to write their own stories. We're archiving them in the local history vault. Not official, but real. Would love yours if you're willing." She took the paper, stared at the library's embossed seal on the top corner. "I'll think about it." That afternoon, Eleanor walked past the bakery, down Sycamore Street, and paused outside a red brick building that used to be the elementary school. It was now a community arts center, but the bones were the same. She could still see the path where children had once lined up for recess. She stood at the fence and closed her eyes. The little girl who had once sat alone on the swings, watching the others chase each other, now stood outside in silence, not with longing, but with recognition. She had made it through. Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a page from her journal. She tore it carefully, folded it 3 times, and tucked it between the bars of the fence. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for her. That evening, as the sky turned amber and the breeze rustled the trees near her home, Eleanor brewed another cup of lavender tea. She opened the paper Lionel had given her and laid it flat on the table. Local history. Memory project, please tell us who you are. Start with your name. She uncapped her pen. My name is Eleanor May Anders. And I was there. The Saturday market had always been a ritual, though Eleanor didn't go every weekend. Some days, the weight of memories lingered too long in her joints, and other days she just didn't feel like being around so many voices. But this morning felt different, as if something in her chest had been cleared. like a window opened after a long winter. She slipped on her cardigan and stepped out with her canvas tote, pausing just long enough to pluck a sprig of mint from the garden to tuck into her bag. The smell grounded her. It reminded her of starting over. The market was already alive when she arrived. Crates of apples, burlap sacks of potatoes, jars of honey catching sunlight. Children ran between stalls with sticky fingers. The scent of cinnamon and roasting chestnuts drifted through the air. Eleanor walked slowly, absorbing it all. She stopped at the herb stall first, where Miriam, a wiry woman with a wide smile and hands always speckled with soil, was arranging lavender bundles into tight bouquets. "Miss L." Miriam greeted her. "Need more lemon balm? I've got a batch that practically hummed to me this morning." Eleanor chuckled. "Just looking today. Your herbs already know my kitchen better than I do." Miriam's laugh rang out, and for a moment, Eleanor felt something loosen behind her ribs. It was easy here. Safe. No one asked too many questions. No one pressed too hard. She picked out a few carrots, some eggs, and a tin of chamomile honey from other vendors. Her tote grew heavy with ordinary things she once thought she'd never deserve. Then she turned down the far aisle, the one with handcrafts and stitched goods, and froze mid-step. A woman stood there, older than Eleanor by a few years perhaps, with her back turned. But there was something in the way she held her shoulders rigid and controlled that made Eleanor's body tense. When the woman turned around, her breath caught. It was Helen Dorsey, her childhood neighbor, her mother's closest friend. In the quiet geography of Eleanor's memories, Helen had always been a peripheral figure. The woman who brought casseroles after holidays. The one who'd watched Eleanor limp once and said, "Your child is just clumsy, Clara." Without waiting for an answer, Eleanor hadn't seen her since the trial. Helen's eyes skimmed the market, pausing as they reached Eleanor. Recognition came slowly. Her brows furrowed, then lifted. "Eleanor?" she said, her voice cracked. By surprise, not age. Eleanor's fingers curled slightly around the edge of her tote. "Hello, Helen." Helen stepped forward. She looked older, frailer, but her expression carried that same tight composure Eleanor remembered from years ago. "I didn't expect to see you here," Helen said. "It's been, my goodness, it's been a long time." "Yes." Silence. Pressed between them, thick and strange. Around them, the market carried on, people bartering for apples, children tugging at sleeves. But Eleanor felt like the air had thinned. "I heard what happened," Helen said finally. "The trial, everything. I didn't know." Eleanor held her gaze. "You lived next door." "I didn't know the details," Helen clarified, eyes dropping to her hands. "We all had suspicions, but no one ever said anything. Your mother always told us you were sensitive, that you imagine things." "She told me the bruises were my imagination too," Eleanor replied. Quietly. Helen flinched. "I should have said something," she whispered. "I should have asked more questions." Eleanor didn't answer right away. She looked past Helen to the basket of woven scarves on the table, their bright colors catching in the wind. "I don't need you to apologize," Eleanor said finally. "That time in my life is over. But you should have said something. You all should have." "I thought your mother loved you," Helen said softly. Eleanor's voice was low. "So did I." Helen's mouth opened, then closed again. She took a deep breath, reached into her purse, and pulled out a folded handkerchief. "If there's anything I can do now." "There is," Eleanor said, stepping forward. "Don't look away from people just because their stories are hard to hear. Don't assume silence means safety. And don't wait for a child to say the right words before you believe what you already see." Helen's eyes welled slightly. She nodded. Then Eleanor turned and walked away. Not fast, not shaken, just steady. Back home, she unpacked her market goods, placing eggs into the wire basket and carrots in the bowl on the counter. Her hands moved with calm, but her heart raced. Not because she'd seen someone from her past, but because she had spoken the truth aloud, without shame. And not to a therapist or a journal, but to someone who had once helped bury her silence. She boiled water for tea and sat on the porch while the sun crept across the lawn. Dot in her lap, her hands folded gently. She watched the sparrow flit between the branches of the rosemary bush. The breeze played with the edge of her dress, but she remained still. What she had said at the market wasn't just for Helen. It was for the girl she once was, the girl who had waited for someone, anyone, to say, "This isn't right." No one had then, but Eleanor had now. And that mattered. It was just past noon when the phone rang. Eleanor was standing at the sink, rinsing sprigs of thyme for a soup she didn't yet feel like eating. The sound startled her, not because it was unexpected, but because she still hadn't quite made peace with the silence it always followed. The landline rarely rang anymore. The few people who knew her number preferred handwritten notes or quiet visits. It had been years since she'd answered that phone with hope. Still, she wiped her hands on her apron and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" There was a pause, a breath, then a voice, female, soft, unfamiliar. "Hello, ... I'm sorry to bother you. Is this Eleanor Anders?" Eleanor's grip tightened slightly on the cord. "It is. My name is Marcy Connors. I'm a case coordinator with the Department of Family Records in Benton County. We're updating contact logs for long-term custodial files. Your name came up ... as a related party." A silence opened between them. "Related to whom?" Eleanor asked, her voice low. "To Richard Anders." Her stomach didn't drop, not exactly. It was more like something inside her went still. Richard Anders. She hadn't heard his full name spoken by another person in over 25 years. "He passed away last week," the woman continued gently. "There was no next of kin listed on the paperwork. You're not obligated to respond or act. We're required to inform living relations for closure purposes. There are no financial ties, no property, just notification." Eleanor blinked, her eyes focused on the steam rising from the pot on the stove. "Was there anything left?" she asked, though she wasn't sure what she meant. "Only a few belongings. A worn Bible, a sealed envelope marked with your name, and a pressed photograph of a young girl in a rose-patterned sweater." The words landed like soft stones on water, rippling out. She cleared her throat. "You can discard them." "Of course," Marcy said, her voice kind. "I'll make a note." They exchanged a few more pleasantries, neutral, mechanical, and then the line went quiet. Eleanor stood there for several long seconds, receiver still in hand. The hum of the dial tone filled the space between her ribs. She set the phone down. Gently. She hadn't cried when her mother died in prison. And she didn't cry now. She felt no grief, no closure, just a strange hollowness, like the page of a book left blank between two chapters. He was gone. The man who had silenced her, hurt her, broken parts of her she'd never fully recovered, gone with no fanfare. No reckoning, no final words. Just a sealed envelope and a stranger's polite voice over the line. She ladled soup into a bowl and sat by the window, the steam rising in curls around her face. The photograph still sat on the sill, the child and the woman, watching. She whispered, "Not for anyone to hear, you died without ever saying sorry." The soup grew cold in her hands. By late afternoon, she was back in the garden. The air was crisp, the first signs of the season changing visible in the dry rustle of leaves. Her fingers worked the soil around the base of her rosemary, removing dead stems, brushing away crumbling petals. She used to imagine justice would come like thunder, loud, shaking, irreversible. But now she knew better. Justice, if it ever came, looked more like this: an old woman with her knees in the dirt, weeding out what no longer served life. She stood slowly, brushing her palms against her dress, and looked toward the tree line at the back of her property. It had grown thicker over the years. She hadn't walked beyond it since the week she'd arrived in this town. Today, something called her there. She stepped past the rosemary, past the back gate, and followed the narrow footpath worn faint into the grass. The canopy above shifted gently, and birds scattered at her passing. The clearing came suddenly, like memory. A circle of stones, remnants of someone else's fire pit. Eleanor hadn't seen it since her second week in town, when she sat there for hours deciding whether to stay. She sat again now, folding her hands gently over her lap. She thought of the photograph found in her father's cell, the one of her, at 11, in that rose-patterned sweater. How many times had he looked at it? Had he kept it to punish himself, or to remember the child he'd broken? Had he even thought of her at all? It didn't matter. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her small journal, the one with the torn cover and tea stains at the edges. Inside, on a fresh page, she wrote just one line. "You don't get the last word." She closed the book. Then, she reached into her bag and pulled out a single rose from her garden, pale pink, edged with soft brown. Not perfect, but still alive. She laid it in the center of the clearing. Not for him. For her. That evening, Eleanor lit a small fire in the stove. The house filled with warmth, but it was a different kind than the heat she remembered from childhood. The kind that burned without safety, that scorched without light. This warmth was chosen, contained. Belonging to her. She stirred a pot of lentils and read aloud from a library book until the sky dimmed to indigo, and the crickets took over the quiet. As she prepared for bed, she paused once more at the window. No phone calls would come. No letters would arrive. But something had ended, and something else, something quieter, had begun. Eleanor hadn't stepped inside a school building in more than 4 decades, but the old elementary, now a community arts center, had recently announced a reading mentorship program for children struggling with literacy. A flyer taped to the window of the bakery had caught her attention. It was printed in cheerful green ink and asked plainly, "Could you give 1 hour a week to help a child find their voice?" She had walked past it twice before her feet turned back on their own. There was no logical reason to sign up. She was 71. Her knees ached in the rain. Some mornings, her hands didn't feel steady enough to hold a teacup, let alone the curiosity of a child. But the word voice lingered in her mind long after she left the bakery. That night, she sat by the fire, reading the flyer again under the soft light of her lamp. Find their voice. What would it have meant, she wondered, if someone had helped her? Find hers at 8 years old instead of silencing it. She folded the flyer and placed it beside her journal. By the following week, Eleanor had filled out the volunteer form with her careful cursive. She chose the earliest time slot, Tuesdays at 8:15 a.m., when the building would still be quiet, before the rush of mid-morning chatter and the scent of school glue and lunch trays filled the halls. On her first day, the air outside was crisp, heavy with the scent of pine needles and chalk dust. The building looked different than she remembered. The windows were newer, the paint fresher, but the bones were the same. The slight creak of the doorframe, the echo of steps on tile. A young woman with a clipboard greeted her at the entrance. "Miss." Anders? She asked with a warm smile. I'm Carrie, the program coordinator. Thank you so much for volunteering. Eleanor returned the smile, folding her hands in front of her. Happy to be here. It's been a long time since I stepped into a school. Carrie nodded. It has a way of feeling the same, no matter how much changes. You'll be paired with a student named Julian. He's 7. Shy, kind, very bright. Just needs help getting the words to behave. They walked down the hall together, Carrie chatting lightly as Eleanor tried to stay present. Her eyes drifted to the windows, the lockers, the faded scuff marks along the walls. Ghosts of children herself include seemed to flicker in the periphery. Julian sat at a round table near the window of what used to be room 3B. The blackboard was now a smartboard. The alphabet posters had been replaced by illustrated affirmations. Your voice matters. Mistakes mean you're trying. He was small for his age, with dark curls that spilled over his forehead, and a striped sweater too big for his arms. He glanced up, then quickly back down to the book in front of him. Carrie introduced them and gave Eleanor a quick nod before retreating. Eleanor sat gently across from Julian. She didn't speak right away. She let the quiet settle. He didn't look at her, but he didn't fidget either. Finally, she leaned forward just slightly. I used to be afraid of reading aloud, she said. The letters would blur together and run away from me. Julian looked up. Really? Eleanor nodded. I thought if I made a mistake, everyone would laugh. Me too. She smiled. Would you like to read a page together? Just one. He gave a small nod and opened the book. His voice was barely above a whisper, but Eleanor didn't interrupt. When he stumbled over a word, she waited until he looked at her for help, then gently guided him. His shoulders relaxed. He finished the page, then flipped to the next without being asked. They read for 20 minutes. Before she left, he asked, Will you come back next week? Eleanor touched his hand lightly. Yes, Julian, I will. That afternoon she walked home by the long route, past the sycamores and the edge of the park. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying leaves across the path like small dancers. She hadn't expected to feel so much from such a simple moment, watching a child find the confidence to say a single sentence without apology. But something inside her had shifted. She had spent most of her life trying to forget the girl who sat alone in classrooms, afraid of being seen. But now, helping someone else be seen, it didn't feel so frightening anymore. That night, she returned to her journal and wrote, There was a boy today. His name is Julian. He doesn't speak loudly. He reads with his whole body clenched, as if the words might hurt him. But they didn't. Not today. Today they came out in a whisper. And I think that whisper matters. He asked me to come back. And I will. Because maybe someone asking you to stay is one of the most healing things there is. Later, she stood at the window and watched the lights flicker on across town. Her reflection met her gaze in the glass. Her braid hung over one shoulder, silver grey and long. Her eyes were lined but clear. For the first time in years, she didn't just feel like a woman who had survived. She felt like a woman who was helping something begin. On the morning of her 3rd session with Julian, Eleanor paused longer than usual in front of the mirror. The small one above her bathroom sink had a crack running through the bottom left corner, barely visible unless the sun hit it just right. She had never bothered replacing it. There was something honest about it, a truth in the fracture that made it feel less like a flaw and more like a companion. She examined her reflection with quiet curiosity. The soft lines framing her mouth, the slight sag beneath her jaw, the silver woven through her braid, none of it surprised her anymore. But there was something else, something subtler, a return of steadiness in her eyes. Not youth, not energy, but presence. She reached up and adjusted the curve of her braid, then traced a fingertip along the edge of her cheek. "I used to be invisible," she murmured to her reflection. "But I'm not anymore." That day, Julian greeted her with a grin so wide it nearly split his face. He had chosen the book himself, story about a quiet fox who found a voice when no one else was listening. Eleanor let him read every line, stumbling and backtracking, but never giving up. He even laughed once, a bright, surprised sound that startled both of them. When their time ended, he asked her something she hadn't expected. "Do you have grandkids?" Eleanor's hands paused over her bag. "No," she said gently. "I don't." Julian nodded slowly, then glanced at the floor. "My grandma doesn't visit anymore," he said. "She lives in a place with nurses." Eleanor rested her hand on the table between them. "I bet she thinks about you." Julian shrugged. "Maybe." They packed up in silence. But when he turned to leave, he whispered, "I think you'd be a good grandma." The words hit her in a place untouched for years. She only nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him disappear down the hallway. Back at home, she moved through her kitchen like a woman slightly unmoored. The kettle whistled, but she forgot to pour the tea. Her journal lay open on the table, beside a sprig of rosemary, but she didn't pick up the pen. Instead, she returned to the mirror. The same face stared back at her, but now it bore the impression of something someone knew. She saw not only the woman she was, but also the grandmother she could have been. There had been a time when she thought herself too damaged to love properly, that the harm she'd endured had made her unfit to nurture anything, even a houseplant. For years, she avoided children altogether, afraid they would sense something broken in her and step away. But Julian hadn't. He'd invited her in. That evening, Eleanor climbed into the attic dock. She hadn't been up there in over a decade. The air was thick with dust and the scent of cedar and thyme. A single bulb dangled from the rafters, casting a soft amber glow. She moved slowly, lifting boxes with care, sifting through things she'd once stored without meaning to ever revisit. Near the back, she found what she was looking for: a faded cardboard box labeled Emma's room in slanted handwriting. Emma had been the daughter of a neighbor in a town Eleanor once lived in, briefly her first stop after leaving the bus. Emma's mother had worked nights, and for a while Eleanor had watched the child in the afternoons, helping her with homework and tucking her into bed on long shifts. For a few months they'd been like something close to family. Inside the box were a few of Emma's drawings. One showed Eleanor with impossibly long grey hair and arms stretched wide, labelled Miss L and the Sun. She sat back on her heels, tears building slowly. That had been the first time she'd heard herself called Miss L. And now Julian used it too. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had a name again. Not Eleanor the forgotten daughter, or Eleanor the survivor, or Eleanor the woman who disappeared. Just Miss L. The next day, she prepared something different. Instead of just tea and journal pages, she carried a small gift in her tote, one of Emma's drawings, carefully slipped into a new frame. Not for Julian to keep, but to show him, so he'd know that voices, even young ones, can leave marks long after the sound fades. When she arrived at the school, she stopped briefly in the hallway outside the classroom. Through the door's narrow window, she saw Julian already seated, kicking his heels against the legs of the chair, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. For a moment, she didn't move. She let herself feel the weight of it, a child waiting for her, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Not because she was filling a role, but because he had chosen her. She stepped inside. "Hi, Miss L." He beamed. She smiled, easing into the chair beside him. "I brought something to show you." When she unwrapped the framed picture, Julian tilted his head and studied it. "Who's that?" "A little girl I used to know," Eleanor said softly. "She made this for me a long time ago." He looked at the childlike scrawl, the wide arms, the bright yellow sun. "She must have liked you a lot," he said. "I think she did." That night, Eleanor placed the drawing back in the box, but didn't return it to the attic. She set it beside her journal instead. Then she looked in the mirror one more time, not to inspect, not to regret, but to thank the woman looking back. The air inside the community center smelled of sawdust and possibility. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Eleanor had agreed, though. She wasn't sure why to attend the unveiling of the new memory mural. Carrie, the reading coordinator, had extended the invitation weeks ago with a gentle smile and a hopeful tilt of her head. "It's a project from the kids," she had said. "Everyone who's helped them gets a spot on the wall, even if it's just a little one." Eleanor had nodded, but part of her had been unsure. She didn't do well with attention. Most of her life had been spent in the corners of rooms, eyes lowered, presence quiet. But something about the way Julian had grinned that Tuesday morning and said, "You're gonna be on the wall," had made it harder to say no. So she came. The center buzzed with voices, children tugging their parents by the hand, teens comparing paint-splattered jeans, volunteers mingling by the refreshment table. Eleanor stayed near the back, hands folded gently in front of her, fingers resting lightly against the strap of her woven tote. She hadn't worn anything new, just her usual floral print dress and the soft beige cardigan she trusted. Familiarity was armor, and she needed just enough of it to stay grounded. Carrie spotted her from across the room and came walking over with purpose. "You made it," she said, eyes bright. "Come on, everyone's waiting for the first reveal." "I'm better in the second row," Eleanor replied with a half-smile. But she let herself be guided to the edge of the gathering crowd. At the front of the room, a long curtain had been strung across the far wall. Beneath it, paintbrushes lay scattered, still fresh with color. Some of the strokes trailed up the sides of the curtain, restless, creativity refusing to be contained. Carrie stepped forward and spoke briefly to the room. "Each square on this mural represents a voice," she said. "A child who found theirs and the people who helped them speak." There was a pause. Then she nodded to Julian, who stood proudly beside the curtain's edge. He gave it a small tug. The fabric slid down. Gasps, applause, and murmurs filled the room. The mural was a mosaic of chaos and beauty, names written in every color, with fingerprints, doodles, and tiny messages scrawled around them. There were stars, animals, spirals, even whole landscapes tucked into corners. Eleanor scanned it slowly. At first, she didn't see her name. Then Julian pointed. There, in a square near the lower center, painted in soft lavender and framed by tiny green leaves, were the words, "Miss L." She listened. Beneath it, a child's drawing of a woman with a long braid and gentle hands. It looked like the version of her that lived in Julian's mind. Eleanor's throat tightened. She hadn't realized what it would mean to see her name, not Eleanor, not Mrs. Anders, but Miss L in a space created to remember kindness. She stepped closer. Her fingers brushed the air just shy of the painted surface. The crowd thinned as others began to move around the room, admiring different parts of the mural. Julian stayed close by her side, rocking slightly on his heels. "You're really on the wall," he said. "So are you." He beamed. Then, quieter, he added, "I put the flowers around it because I remembered your garden. I thought it would make you smile." Eleanor's heart opened in a way that startled her. She hadn't been expecting tenderness. To arrive here in a noisy room with juice boxes and markers strewn across tables. But here it was. You thought right, she said softly. She stayed long after the event ended, when most of the families had gone home and the noise had settled into soft footsteps and the rustle of paper cups being gathered. Eleanor remained by the mural. Carrie came by again, offering her a cup of tea from the staff lounge. Take your time, she said. The kids will come back on Monday and see it again. But it's yours today too. Eleanor nodded. Once she was alone, she stepped back from the wall and looked at it as a whole. There were names she recognized, others she didn't. But what mattered most wasn't the names. It was the proof. Each square said, I was here. I mattered. Someone saw me. She sat on one of the benches near the window and pulled her journal from her bag. The pages fluttered in the breeze coming through the cracked pane. She wrote, There is a wall now that remembers me. Not for what I endured, not for what I lost, but for something I gave, a name written in lavender. Flowers wrapped around it, a child's drawing of my face. I have lived many lives, one of silence, one of survival, and now one of offering. Sometimes we are remembered not because we shouted, but because we stayed, because we listened. As she closed the journal, she caught her reflection in the window glass. The light from the mural behind her bathed the room in warmth. Her braid rested on her shoulder. Her cardigan was smudged faintly with green paint where Julian had hugged her. Earlier. She didn't mind. She wore it like a badge. The letter arrived. On a Wednesday, folded into a cream envelope with careful script. It was slipped through the door slot sometime before breakfast, landing quietly atop the woven doormat Eleanor had stitched herself. She noticed it after returning from the garden with a handful of sage and mint. The envelope had no stamp. Hand-delivered. She stooped to pick it up and turned it over slowly. Her name, written in blue ink. Miss L. CO Cedar Avenue Garden Cottage. There was something tender about the informal address. No surname, no title. Just the name that had slowly begun to mean something new. Something chosen. Inside the envelope, a single sheet of paper carried an invitation. To Miss L, you are cordially invited to Julian's spring showcase. He will be reading his first full story aloud. He said he won't read it unless you're there. Tuesday at 4 p.m. Room 3B, Community Arts Center. We hope you'll come. With gratitude, Carrie and the Literacy Circle Eleanor sat down in the kitchen, envelope in hand, the herbs forgotten on the counter. Her thumb brushed the curve of the handwriting. She read the line again. He won't read it unless you're there. Something caught in her throat. Not sorrow. Not quite pride either. A sense of fullness. She had spent so much of her life as the one left behind. The one whose name was forgotten. The one uninvited. To birthdays. To dinners. To futures. But this was different. This was a door opening. That evening she pulled her box of sewing supplies from the closet. It had been years since she mended anything beyond a button. But her floral print dress, the one she wore most often, had begun to fray at the cuffs. She worked slowly, stitching by the window in the last of the evening light. The thread trembled in her fingers at times, but she kept at it. The work soothed her. As she patched the hem, she thought of all the other things she had patched over the years: old blankets, worn aprons, a frayed place inside herself she once believed would never hold together again. She finished just as the light disappeared. The dress lay across her lap, quiet and warm. She pressed the repaired edge to her chest for a moment, then folded it neatly across the back of the chair. On Tuesday, she arrived early. Room 3B looked much the same as it had the day of the mural. Unveiling child-sized chairs, colourful posters, a table lined with juice boxes and graham crackers. But today, The chairs had been arranged into neat rows facing the front, where a short wooden podium stood, slightly too tall for the children who would soon speak. Eleanor chose a seat in the second row. Carrie greeted her with a smile, then disappeared into the hallway to help with the lineup of nervous young readers. Parents and volunteers trickled in. Eleanor nodded to a few familiar faces but kept mostly to herself, hands folded gently in her lap. Her repaired sleeve brushed her wrist each time she shifted, and she found comfort in the sensation. Julian entered last, holding a few stapled pages against his chest like they were treasure. When he spotted Eleanor, his shoulders dropped with visible relief. He hurried over and bent slightly to whisper, "I'm glad you came." "I wouldn't have missed it," she said. When it was his turn, Julian stepped behind the podium and cleared his throat. His story was titled "The Fox Who Found a Friend." He read slowly, pausing now and then to breathe or glance at Eleanor. His voice trembled once, but he didn't stop. The story was simple. A fox who used to hide under brambles, afraid of everything, meets a sparrow who sings to him even when he won't answer. The sparrow stays. The fox listens. And eventually, the fox speaks. When Julian finished, the room erupted in soft applause. Carrie hugged him, and he returned to his seat beside Eleanor with pink cheeks and bright eyes. She leaned in. "That fox was very brave." He looked at her and said, "So was the sparrow." Eleanor didn't speak. She simply placed her hand gently over his for a moment, then let it go. After the event, as chairs scraped and laughter rose, Eleanor stepped outside into the courtyard behind the center. The sun was just beginning to dip, casting amber light across the pavement. She stood quietly, watching the silhouettes of children running circles around their parents, holding cupcakes and paper folders. Carrie joined her a few minutes later, holding 2 cups of lemonade. Julian asked if we could add his fox story to the mural, she said with a smile. "There's still space." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I think the wall would be lucky to have it." Carrie paused. "He talks about you often, you know. Says you listen different. Not like teachers. Not like grown-ups. Just like someone who sees him." Eleanor looked out across the garden, where a wind chime clinked softly. "That's all I ever wanted," she said. "For someone to see me." Carrie didn't reply. She didn't need to. When Eleanor returned home, she placed the invitation beside the framed drawing from Emma. 2 names. 2 children. 2 different chapters. And between them, herself. No longer the girl who disappeared. No longer just the woman who ran, but the one who stayed. The one who listened. The little chapel on the edge of town wasn't much more than a wooden shell with cracked windows and ivy creeping up the stone foundation. But Eleanor had always admired it. It stood near the cemetery, at the top of a low hill where the wind seemed to breathe slower, more reverently. She had walked past it for years on. The way to the grocer, the market, the library, and though she had never stepped inside, she often slowed her pace as she passed. There was something about its stillness, how it seemed to ask for nothing yet held space for everything. Today, she brought her journal. Her bag held nothing else, no tea thermos, no mints, not even her knitting. Just the journal closed with its leather strap wrapped 3 times and tucked tight. The weather was soft. Mid-April light filtered through the clouds like lace. The wind stirred the new leaves on the ash trees, and the path to the chapel was lined with scattered petals from an early blooming dogwood. She climbed the hill carefully, her breath steady, her steps deliberate. At the top, she found the bench. It was older than she remembered. Moss grew at the legs, and the wood creaked slightly as she eased herself down. She sat facing the chapel door, which hung just slightly ajar. The interior was dark, but welcoming in a way she hadn't anticipated, like a space that had been waiting. She didn't go inside. She opened the journal instead. When I was 8, I believed God was a ceiling with eyes. I imagined he watched everything but never moved, never spoke. He saw the bruise. He saw the silences. And he did nothing. For years I held that against him. But now, I think maybe God wasn't in the ceiling at all. Maybe he was in the girl who didn't stop writing stories, even when no one read them. Maybe he was in the neighbor's mother who offered a second cookie and a quiet room. Maybe he was in the bus driver who didn't ask why I had no ticket home. Maybe God is not the one who watches, but the one who waits. And maybe he's been waiting for me to come back to this bench. She looked up. The chapel door shifted slightly. In the breeze, she could hear the distant hum of traffic far below, softened by the hill and the trees and time. A bird landed on the railing beside her, blinked once, and flew off without fanfare. Eleanor sat in the quiet for a long time. She thought about Julian, about his fox story, about the mural that now held both their names. She thought about Emma, and the drawing with the long braid and sun-colored crayon. She thought about herself, how she used to shrink when her name was called, how she used to flinch when someone reached for her hand, how she used to sleep with one ear open, waiting for footsteps that meant danger, not comfort. All of that had once defined her. Now, it didn single quotes t. She reached for a small stone near the bencher. Flat one, weathered at the edge, and ran her fingers across its surface. Then she pulled a pen from her pocket. She hadn't planned this, but her hands moved with quiet purpose as she wrote 3 simple words across the stone surface. I'm here. She placed it at the chapel's door, just inside the threshold, where light from the outside could still touch it. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't a plea. It was a truth. On the walk home, Eleanor didn't hurry. The world seemed slower now, not because she had aged, but because she was paying better attention. She stopped to smell the lilacs blooming outside the merino's gate. She watched the squirrel pause mid-run to scratch behind its ear. Back at the cottage, she boiled water for tea, then sat in her usual chair by the window and watched the light change on the framed photographs. She didn't write that night. She didn't need to. Instead, she folded her hands gently and whispered aloud, "Thank you for waiting." The next morning there was a knock at the door. Not loud, just 3 soft taps. She opened it to find Carrie standing there, holding a brown paper bag and looking slightly sheepish. "Morning," Carrie said. "I stopped by the bakery and thought of you. They had lemon shortbread." Eleanor smiled. "You know I can't say no to shortbread." Carrie handed over the bag. "Julian's working on a new story. Wants you to read the first draft." "I'd be honored." Carrie lingered for a moment. Then, more quietly, "We're hosting a small gathering next month for mentors, readers, friends of the center. Would you come?" Eleanor didn't pause this time. "Yes," she said. "Good," Carrie replied. "Because you're on the planning committee now." They both laughed. When the door closed behind her, Eleanor felt a new kind of stillness in the room. Not empty, not waiting. Just settled. It began like most mornings, with rosemary and silence. Eleanor stood barefoot on the flagstone path that circled her herb garden. The air held a hint of dew, the kind that settled on leaves with reverence. A soft breeze stirred the hem of her dress. Birds trilled in the distance, not urgently, but with a kind of contented rhythm, as if they too understood that something had been healed in this patch of earth. She reached down to pinch a sprig of thyme, rolling it gently between her fingers. The scent bloomed, earthy and sharp, and she closed her eyes. This was not the life she had expected. But it was the life she had chosen. The new gate had been her spring project. The old wooden one had begun to sag. The hinges rusted into a permanent slant. This new one, a gift from the community center's carpenter, was made of iron and twisted in soft curves, painted a gentle green that matched the underside of the lavender leaves. Julian had come by to help her hang it. He was taller now, just a little, and spoke with more confidence than when they'd first met. His latest story, one about a tree that dreamed of flight, sat folded inside her journal, waiting to be read again. "You should name the gate," he had said, holding one of the screws as she steadied the post. She chuckled. "Name it? Everything that opens should have a name." She hadn't responded then. That later, alone, she'd whispered one. Return. Today. She placed a chair near the gate, not facing the house, but the street. Her hands moved with ease now. The old tremor that used to haunt her fingertips had softened. Maybe from the tea. Maybe from time. Maybe from the simple act of being seen. She brought her journal and the letter Julian had written after the last showcase. It had no punctuation, just a tangle of sentences and hand-drawn stars. But it was signed at the bottom, in capital letters. "Your friend Julian." She hadn't had many friends, but now the word meant something. It meant someone chose you and kept choosing, not because they needed something, but because your presence mattered. She read the letter again, then folded it with care and tucked it into her journal. The gate creaked slightly in the breeze. She glanced toward the sidewalk, not expecting anyone in particular. Most mornings were quiet. People passed on the way to town, dog walkers, couples, teenagers with backpacks and earbuds. They often waved. Sometimes they stopped to admire the garden. But this time, someone turned in. A woman, maybe mid-40s. Dark hair pulled into a tight bun. A purse clutched too tightly against her hip. She hesitated at the entrance. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. The woman spoke first. Are you Eleanor Anders?" It had been a long time since someone used both names like that. Eleanor nodded. "I am." The woman stepped forward, still unsure. "My name is Lacey. I think you knew my aunt." Her name was Clara. The name didn't hit like it used to. No sharp twist in the chest. Just a quiet recognition. "She was my mother." Lacey nodded. "She never spoke of you. Not really. Just once, when she was sick. I was 15. She mentioned someone she couldn't face. Someone she'd failed." Eleanor didn't speak. "I didn't understand then," Lacey went on. "But later, after she passed, I found some things. Old photos. A letter she never mailed. It was addressed to you." She pulled a small envelope from her purse. "I debated for months whether to find you, whether to leave it alone." Eleanor took the envelope in hands. It was yellowed at the corners. No return address. Just her name. Eleanor May. "I don't know what it says," Lacey added. "That, if it's too late to matter, I'm sorry." Eleanor looked up. "It's not too late." They stood in silence. Then she motioned gently toward the gate. "Would you like to sit?" Lacey hesitated, then nodded. They settled on the chairs. Eleanor in her usual spot, Lacey beside her, both facing the garden. The thyme, the sage, the mint, they rustled like old friends whispering nearby. Eleanor didn't open the letter yet. She let the moment breathe. "I'm not angry," she said at last. "I was, for years, but not now." Lacey's voice wavered. "I wish I had known. I would have come sooner." "You came when you were ready." Eleanor looked down at the envelope in her lap. her thumb brushing the edge. She didn't need to read it right away. The words would still be there tomorrow, or next week. But something about receiving it after all these years closed a circle she hadn't known was still open. She set it beside her journal dot and folded her hands gently in her lap. That evening, when the sun dipped low and the wind carried the scent of lemon balm through the kitchen window, Eleanor lit a candle and sat by the sill dot the framed photo of Young. Eleanor still stood beside Julian's letter and Emma's drawing. She added the unopened letter to the collection. Each item one voice, one thread, one act of remembering dot outside. The new gate glinted softly under the fading light. Behind it, the garden leaned into dusk, full of things once thought lost. And Eleanor, hands folded, finally home,